Welcome to Platinum Stories, your sanctuary for sleep and serenity. Before we begin, I would like to thank you for allowing me the privilege of guiding you into a deep, peaceful sleep. Enjoy. The Girl on the Step. No one in the city seemed to remember the first time they saw the girl on the step, which was to say that her arrival had been as gradual and certain as the coming of summer. One day she was a rumour, the next she was part of the morning. She wore a navy peacoat that was always buttoned, even as the June heat glazed the streets like a wet tongue, and she sat with a cracked leather valise perched on her knees, as if she were forever on the brink of leaving. The brownstone steps, 3 in all, belonged to 71B West Avery, a building as swollen with tenants as a sponge with rainwater. The neighbours had long-standing détente about the city's mysteries. They accepted with grateful fatigue the peeling paint, the wild rumour of rats in the walls, the way the plumbing sometimes sang like a lonely soprano, and most of all, the presence of the girl whom no one could recall inviting in. She was always there, dawn or dead of moon, at equinox or the slurred fever days of August. The regulars began to suspect she slept on that step, or perhaps slipped neatly into the gap behind the garbage cans between sunset and sunrise. Children living in 71B, sent out to collect takeout or run errands, devised games around her. It was bad luck to take the steps without touching the girl's valise, or her coat's brass button, or the ragged end of her dark braid. Good luck leaving a coin on her lap, or a stick of gum balanced on the valise. Once a week, sometimes more, the building's oldest resident, a German man named Hildebrandt, who had outlasted 3 wives and 2 wars, would tap her on the shoulder as he passed. "Mädchen," he'd say, fixing her with his miser's eyes, "where's your mother?" "Your papa?" Her response was always the same, "Almost home." Then she'd smile, not like a child smiles, but as if she were familiar with the world's little jokes, including this one. After that, she'd retuck her chin and resume watching the street. No one had ever seen her eat, but once or twice she was spotted shelling sunflower seeds, the cracked hulls chipping the mortar. They gathered these shells in the gutter, forming a fleet of tiny canoes swept along during the 2 a.m. street cleaning. Some tenants whispered she ate at night, from the handouts left by sentimental insomniacs, or the soft-hearted night shift from the bodega. Still, the janitor, Cesario, swore he saw her fingers empty and blue, not even a ghost of salt on them, when he keyed into the building at sunrise. The city's street sweepers called her La Niña de la Valija. Once, a white-shirted cop stopped to ask her age and name, but when she answered, 12, and Isadora, he grinned, flicked the valise with a fingertip and told her to look both ways, as if she were a very small, very stubborn traffic cone. On Fridays, when the rabbi's wife would sit beside her after Shabbat errands, the girl's voice grew softer, and she'd, almost secretly, wish her good rest. The rabbi's wife would tuck a square of halva between the peacoat's buttons, right over Isadora's heart, and the girl would let it melt there as the day wore on, until the sleeve needed wiping. They shared a silence. The rabbi's wife sometimes leaned close as if trying to hear something that the girl's breath had almost uttered. If anyone cared to notice, Isadora did not stray farther than her step. She claimed the territory of the stoop with a vigilance that was both regal and desperate. God forbid a pizza delivery boy or package courier linger on the threshold. A look from Isadora could unnerve even the most hardened adolescent, sending them hurrying away with shoes tripping over their own laces. She kept the entrance clear in both senses. The real estate of her step was always swept of leaves and smoke and, other than the detritus of her seed husks, immaculate. When fall arrived, and with it the sculpted hound's tooth shadows of flighty sparrows, she would scrape away the season's offering of yellow leaves every day at dawn, gathering them into tiny piles against the iron banister, arranging them by shape and vibrancy. Sometimes she pressed them flat in the valise, or wove them into little crowns she'd balance on the post till a breeze toppled them. But never, not once, did she leave the margins of her realm. It was the first snow that did it. One morning the step was empty, the girl, the valise, gone. In their place, a crown of pressed yellow leaves and a single coin, old and smooth with age. No one said much. Hildebrandt tapped the air and whispered, "Mädchen, you made it home." The rabbi's wife left Halva once more, just in case. The stoop stayed swept. Children still touched the railing. And for weeks after, the third step held a faint warmth, as if someone had just risen from it. Almost. The Vanishing Act. I could not say for certain when I first noticed the disappearances, not at least in a way that would stand up to outside scrutiny. Perhaps it was the day I reached for my favourite mug and found only its absence, a cup-shaped vacancy in the cupboard between the chipped blue saucer and the spider-webbed shot glass. Or maybe it was the night I woke with a start, convinced that a mouse or a shadow had scuttled beneath the radiator, only to realise it was the hush of something utterly gone, a hush where even the dust motes moved reverently. This is how it has always been, at least since the house began to shift. Chairs migrated, pillows vanished, door hinges creaked closed and refused to open. My own routines, so steadfast, so bricked in with habit, grew porous, as if a draught had found its way into my life and was slowly blowing little bits of it away. At first I blamed the neighbours. They were new. A couple with twin daughters, always matched to the season in cheerful outerwear, always waving with plasticine friendliness from their side of the fence. But why would neighbours steal, say, the remote for my ceiling fan or the green-handled spatula dulled by 12 years of omelettes? I searched their windows for a familiar glimmer, expecting to catch a glimpse of my things reincarnated on their shelves, but all I found was the repetitive choreography of their evenings. One girl applies herself to a puzzle, the other props her chin in her palm to stare at nothing. The parents orbit silently, folding laundry or tapping on their phones. After the neighbours, I blame myself. This phase was even less productive, turning every drawer inside out, checking the same cupboard 3 times. I retraced my own movements, suspicious of the way I set down a pencil or a glass of water and forgot them immediately. It occurred to me that I might have entered the early stages of some debilitating brain condition, early onset, silent, incurable. I typed my symptoms into a search engine and recoiled at the dull misery of the forums. People begged for someone to believe them, to assure them that these flea bite losses weren't the first signs of dementia. The forums did not, could not, promise such things. I started keeping a list. Every disappearance, however minor, scrawled onto a legal pad beside the sink. I had always maintained lists, groceries, birthdays, books to read in retirement, but this one was different. Its entries were like tiny, neat funerals. Cheese grater, red plastic, phone charger, last seen plugged in close to the bathroom, birthday card from Uncle Lou. I made hash marks each time I searched for the item, as if repeated attention would thicken its ghostly outline and call it home. I told no one. Ashamed to be haunted by such trifles, I kept my rituals private, even as the evidence mounted. Tape measurer, missing. Favourite sweatshirt, soft, shapeless, nearly translucent with age. Missing. A wedge from a half-eaten pie in the fridge, then the fork I used to eat it, then the Pyrex container itself, leaving behind only a faint, vibratory sense of subtraction. The list grew longer. I began to write in smaller and smaller handwriting to conserve space, as if, by economizing the language of loss, I could make it less real. The cat was collateral. She began to lose weight. When I called her, she no longer appeared immediately, but after long intervals, slinking from nowhere, aloof and slightly accusing. At night she pawed at the bedroom door, then sulked in corners I did not remember furnishing. One morning I watched her stare for a full minute at a blank patch of wall, her tail flicking with intent, before she padded away, as if she'd suddenly remembered somewhere else she needed to be. I recognized myself in this, the bewilderment, the blank periods. It was unnerving to see my own confusion reflected in something with such crisp whiskers, such certainty of purpose. Eventually, the list outgrew the pad. I began to tape auxiliary sheets to the fridge, the inside of the pantry, the bathroom mirror. They multiplied, became a sort of wallpaper, a visual stutter of memory and absence. I wondered if I would eventually run out of things, if the house would simply hollow itself from the inside out, leaving me to drift among the husks of what used to be. I began to photograph the rooms before I left for work each morning, obsessively cataloguing chair angles, book spines, soap dispensers. My phone filled with near-identical pictures of my own kitchen, my own bedside table, as if I were trying to catch the house in the act. It was during this documentation campaign that I noticed. The gaps, the absences, had a pattern. They radiated outward from the upstairs guest room, not in a direct line, but more like the concentric circles in a pond after a stone drops. Subtle but hypnotizing. It was at this moment I began to question the world I once knew. Penguin in the fountain. In the morning, just as the cleaning crew was unlocking the glass doors of the Chambers Hill Mall, the security guard discovered the penguin in the fountain. It sat half submerged, wearing aviator sunglasses and the kind of plastic grass skirt sold at party supply stores, its black and white feathers glistening in the brackish chlorinated water. The penguin didn't seem particularly alarmed, but it did look, in a way, the guard would later struggle to describe, bemused. The guard's name was Henry, and he took his job seriously. He prided himself on being unflappable, the kind of man who had once escorted a whole marching band of cosplayers out of the food court without breaking a sweat. But the penguin, an actual penguin, flippers, beak, and all, not a mall mascot or a prank, made him pause. For a moment, he tried to recall the protocol for this, but his training had not prepared him for aquatic, flightless birds. Henry circled the fountain, watching the bird with the wary respect he reserved for unpredictable teenagers and kiosks selling flying drones. The penguin watched him back, cocking its head so the sunglasses slid down its beak and floated lazily on the surface. It seemed neither pleased nor displeased, simply present, as if it had always been meant for this fountain and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. He radioed it in. There was even a dedicated button for disturbance at the central water feature, which up until now had meant displaced lawn furniture or, once, an entire fondue set, and requested animal control. Reception was patchy in the atrium, so he added, "It's wearing clothes, like people's clothes." While he waited, Henry set about cordoning off the immediate area with yellow plastic tape. Early morning mall walkers peered curiously through the glass doors, their sneakers pacing in impatient arcs on the tile. A few pulled out their phones, fingers poised over camera apps. Henry gave them the look, the same one he'd used on the teenagers who'd tried to skate the escalators. But the penguin was undeniably a spectacle, and the onlookers pressed closer to the doors. Animal control finally arrived in the form of Marjorie Krantz, who wore khaki with a level of authority Henry envied. She strode through the food court carrying a net, a crate, and the matter-of-fact resignation of one who had seen stranger things. "That's a first," Marjorie said, observing the penguin through aviator-shaded eyes, a single eyebrow raised. "What's the backstory here?" Henry gave her the facts as he knew them, which didn't take long. "It was here when I opened up, clothes and all." "Looks Antarctic," she mused, kneeling near the fountain's edge. "And that skirt's custom too. Someone put a lot of work into this." The penguin tilted its head at Marjorie, then flopped out of the fountain and waddled to her, dripping a trail of chlorinated water and dignity in equal measure. Marjorie regarded the approach with a shrewd calm and thumbed a treat from her belt pouch, a small, oily fish that she held just above the penguin's eyeline. The bird hesitated, shuffled closer, and plucked the fish with surgical precision from Marjorie's fingers. Henry saw a brief flash of something like respect pass between them, a professional courtesy among beings involved in crisis response. "There's a tag on its leg." Marjorie coaxed the penguin onto her lap and inspected the band. Looks like university property. She recited a string of numbers as Henry scribbled it onto a form with the urgency of a man searching for a comfortable story to tell himself. "I'll get you a towel," he offered, though neither Penguin nor Handler seemed to require it. Still, Henry fetched the cleanest roll of brown paper towels from the restrooms and set them near Marjorie, as if the display of preparedness might reassert some sense of chain of command. "Thanks," Marjorie said, and with a practiced hand dabbed the bird dry, all the while scanning for further clues, lacerations, signs of recent travel, or, in the narrative Henry was already drafting in his head, evidence of a break-in at the community college's biology lab. This penguin, though, bore nothing but a faint odor of artificial butter and something beneath it, marine and complicated, like the inside of a seashell warmed by the late sun. Marjorie settled the penguin into the crate. It blinked once, then tucked its head under a wing like it had planned this all along. "I'll trace the tag," she said. "Looks like a lost research subject, or someone's idea of art." She glanced at the grass skirt on the fountain's edge. "Want that?" Henry picked it up. It smelled faintly of salt and sunscreen. "Maybe." Back at his desk, he filled out the report. Under nature of disturbance, he wrote, "Unscheduled aquatic visitor. Dressed for vacation." As the moor quieted and lights dimmed, he passed the fountain again. He paused, then laid the skirt on the rim, just in case. Secrets of the Boneyard. The Boneyard sparkled. A layer of frozen dew glimmered on the skulls, vertebrae and oddments of iron and glass scattered across the sand, as if each relic had been etched with a secret code of frost. The boy's mother said there were years when the desert never thawed. Inside their trailer, voices would crystallize in mid-air, and by spring the stories would drop like snowflakes from the ceiling. Hank's story, his real one, the one he never told, began with a lie. It wasn't the sort of lie that could be buried in drift or choked out by tumbleweed. It was small, bright, and hard, like the seed of an invasive plant. The time he'd told his sister there were diamonds buried under the boneyard if you just dug deep enough. He'd meant to make her laugh, but she'd believed him, and that had changed everything. Now, years later, Hank was digging again with a borrowed trowel, wrist aching in the cold, his breath a cloud around his head. The ground was stiff and unyielding, laced with veins of ice. Each scoop uncovered more fragments, rabbit jawbone, the crescent of a rusted oil can, a button as blue as the desert sky at dawn. He worked from the edge of last year's crater, expanding it an inch at a time. Somewhere below he imagined the frost had preserved his sister's laugh, brittle and silver, waiting for spring. There was no one around. The trailers huddled at the far end of the flats, all windows shut tight, and the frost muted the static crackle of a neighbor's radio. A crow wheeled overhead, executing loops with the sharp, hollow bravado of an expert showman. Hank pretended not to notice. He pressed on, the trowel slicing through the crust and into the yielding dust beneath. He didn't remember what he was looking for anymore, or if he ever had, but the motions had become a daily rite. There was a comfort in the repetition, the careful excavation of memory and refuse. Early on, his mother would lean out the trailer's warped screen door and call for him to bring breakfast. Then the calls dwindled, faded to nods, and became a silence that meant she trusted him not to wander too far from her line of sight. With the back of his glove, Hank brushed a stripe of icy mud off the latest find. A marble, its swirl still visible under a matrix of frost. He held it to the dawn like a lens. The sun was rising through a gauze of cirrus, and for a moment, everything, his breath, the world, the ache in his hand, was caught inside the globe. He set the marble in his pocket and paused, listening for the way the ground settled after a dig. It was a hush layered on hush, a secret handshake between earth and air. Then he crouched and pressed his ear to the grit, as if the emptiness beneath the sand might tell him something if only he listened hard enough. His mother's voice did not call. The trailer's windows were dark, handprints layered on the glass, each one pale and blooming like the memory of a touch. He worked until the trowel hit something stubborn. A nodule, not bone or junk, but the hard resistance of something that had not belonged here. He widened the hole, prying with his cold, numbed fingers, and unearthed it, a knob of fused plastic or glass inscribed with faint markings, like the fossil of some imagined alphabet. He wiped it on his sleeve and held it up. Letters, maybe. Or just the worn symbols of a long-gone brand. He rolled the object in his palm, feeling its strangeness, and wondered if this was what diamonds were, if diamonds could be melted and misshapen and full of old air. He pocketed the find and stood, brushing the cold from his knees. From the crown of the rise, he could see the Boneyard sprawling out in all directions, an accidental museum curated by wind and happenstance. There were stories here, only they didn't drop from the ceiling when the world unfroze. You had to drag them up, one scoop at a time, and hope they made sense above ground. He turned back toward the trailer, half hoping for movement behind the window. But the glass was blank, mirrored silver with the sun's new light. His mother would still be asleep, or gone walking the desert trails she used to trace when the thaw came too early for comfort and too late for trust. At the edge of the Boneyard, Hank placed the marble and the strange fused relic on a flat stone, letting them catch the sun. He didn't know why, only that they didn't belong in his pocket anymore. When he reached the trailer, the door was shut. A note fluttered in the breeze, pinned with a bit of wire. Just his name, in his mother's handwriting. Inside, the silence was complete. Her coat was gone. On the table, a steaming thermos waited. He took a sip, bitter, hot. Then he stepped back out into the frost-bright morning and started walking, not toward the crater this time, but out, toward the open flats where the sun was rising. Midnight at the Auberge. The night doorman at the Auberge du Parc had once been a violinist, before the arthritis and the drinking, before the rain even, and tonight he was there again, hunched behind the brass-studded desk, watching with a ponderous and infinitesimal care as the minute hand threatened midnight. In the eternally lit lobby of the Auberge, it was always late. The lighting scheme had been calculated by consultants to give the impression of coziness, but to the night man, it felt like a perpetual morning after, a place where memory hung in the air like last year's cologne. On the sofa, in the silent radius of a Persian lamp, a woman in a camel hair coat had been asleep since 11:07. She belonged to suite 22B, but had drifted into the lobby as if magnetized, and nodded off between the GQ and the ancient New Yorker. Her shoes were off, feet curled under her, and the doorman watched as one stocking toe worked its way in a slow reflex through the woolen nap of the couch. He listened for the elevator, for any sign of a disturbance from the floors above, but the hotel was quiet, guests asleep or elsewhere, and the only ongoing crisis was the slow drip at the corner of the front window, where rain tracked a line through the dust of the city. Sometime in the last hour the night had thickened. The avenue beyond the glass had the blurred, aquatic hush of a long exposure. He wondered if the woman would wake, if she would startle at the shock of her presence, or resume her sleep in the heart-shaped hollow she'd made in the furniture. There were rules about guests in the lobby after 11, rules about appearances, but it was less complicated to let her be. The world outside the hotel shimmered with the promise of inconvenience. Here, inside this aquarium of synthetic blue, the troubles had already happened, and the aftermath was rendered in miniature. Disarrayed magazines, empty glasses, a lamp slightly askew from its base. In the lobby mirror, behind the potted ficus, the doorman could see himself reflected, from the slight slump of his once straight back, right down to the faded stripes of his uniform. He scratched a reminder into his notepad. Call Mr. Golub's car for 6:30. Though Mr. Golub hadn't checked in, and the morning might just as well never arrive. At midnight, the phone rang one of those old, throaty bells that seemed to summon generations at once. The doorman snatched the receiver on instinct. Auberge du Parc, he announced, voice slowed by long practice, each syllable given a place to rest. A man on the other end, foreign or maybe very tired, said, "Is there someone waiting in your lobby? I think she's mine." There was a pause, some wind in the receiver. The faintest click, as if the caller now regretted the effort. The doorman glanced up as if the act of mentioning the woman had increased her density in the room. He studied the slope of her shoulders, her rain-darkened hair fanned out over the upholstery like something feathered and fallen. He could have said she was beautiful, but the word was a blank check in a world of insufficient funds. She was simply there, asleep, neither more nor less than what the lobby asked for. "There is," he said, drawing the moment out as if waiting for the caller to hang up or break character. "A woman. She's not expecting anyone." A laugh, barely audible, dry, spilled through the wires. "No one is at this hour." The voice was working hard to sound amused, but with all the effort of a man fighting sleep. "Can you give her a message?" The doorman watched her sleeping form, her chest rising less than the beat of the clock, her hands tented together, the knuckles lined with faint white valleys of worry. "I can write it down," he offered, already reaching for the pad. There was a rattle, maybe a train in the distance, city machinery, or just the decay of the line. The man sounded older now, or perhaps always had. "Tell her he waited 2 hours and the boots were a mistake. She'll know." The doorman dutifully copied down these peculiar instructions, feeling himself briefly possessed by the drama of strangers. "Is there a name, sir?" he said, pen poised with a ceremonial gravity. But the silence had thickened on the other end, as if the man had melted into the circuitry. Not even a dial tone, just the soft hush of that rain, amplified and refracted 1,000 ways in the empty space between words. He set the receiver down, careful not to wake the woman. The doorman folded the note and set it gently on the table beside her, then returned to his post, the chair sighing beneath him. Outside, the rain had thinned to a whisper. She didn't stir. He watched her a moment longer, then closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to rest, and let the quiet settle in. The minute hand ticked past 12. Somewhere the ice machine hummed. The lobby held its breath. Death in the projection booth. Projectionist number 3 in the booth at the Starlight Cinema died on a Tuesday, and nobody noticed until the middle of the matinee. The Starlight was the last of its kind, a single-screen concrete bunker in a retail strip so dead it felt lunar, with its wide parking lot veined with grass and crabapple saplings. On weekdays, the lobby filled with the smell of artificial popcorn and the slow decay of the carpet's spilled soda, and the only customers were regulars, retired couples, young mothers with strollers, and men who, like ticks, fed on the cool darkness of the theatre itself more than the films. On the Tuesday in question, Mrs. Larrabee arrived at 12:15 sharp, as always. She wore a turquoise jumpsuit and a cardigan draped around her shoulders, and her hair was the colour of skim milk. She liked to be the first in, to get the end seat on row 5, because she hated the feeling of being trapped. Her husband had died in row 5 though, so sometimes she forgot which seat she'd hated more. Clint, the manager, greeted her with his mouth but not his eyes. "You're early, Phyllis." "I like to watch the crew mop," she replied. "Gives a girl something to believe in." Clint's laugh was a burr in the throat. He dabbed at the sticky counter with a wad of napkins. "Today's a good one," he said. "French. Award-winning, I think." "I don't like awards. They ruin people." She shuffled in with her baggie of buttermints and sat in the lobby's solitary metal chair, watching as a teenager swept a half-moon of popcorn from under the claw machine. On the wall beside her, a cardboard cutout of a dinosaur holding a soda cup had been gnawed down to a single painted claw. The lobby clock said 12:27. Across the vacant parking lot, sunlight glanced off the windshields of a dozen cars, but none of them had faces peering in. The glass doors stayed shut until a mother and her toddler arrived, the child braced awkwardly on her hip, hair in beads, silent and intent. At 12:49, Clint shuffled Mrs. Larrabee and the mother inside. The house lights were low and the air had a wet linen chill. The screen flashed silent trivia slides. Mrs. Larrabee found her seat, humming softly. The preview reel began and she leaned back, letting the dimness wash over her, the sense of safety, the knowledge that for some time nothing would be expected of her except sustained existence. The French movie began with a man in a black turtleneck standing in the rain. Mrs. Larrabee took out a mint, held it on her tongue and let the oceanic sweetness dissolve, not chewing, not rushing. She always tried to synchronize her candy lifespan with the film's running time, something to pace the hours with. Halfway in, she was folded into the kind of trance that only foreign dialogue could induce. Words washed over her, untranslatable, and the sound of her breathing joined the score. At some point, the projection flickered, a subtle hiccup in the steady beam, but it was quickly righted. Mrs. Larrabee frowned and made a note in her mental ledger. Last week the sound had slipped. The week before, the film reel had stuttered on a frame so long she'd memorized the actor's nose. She wondered if Clint was cutting hours again. She imagined a skeleton crew, or maybe just the ghosts of projectionists, left spinning the reels for eternity. When the sunlit lobby emerged at the end of the film, Mrs. Larrabee waited for the world to reconstitute, pixel by pixel, but something snagged. It wasn't the sickly aftertaste of the mints, or the disinterested clatter of the ticket machine as the mother and toddler trickled out. It was that Clint, who should have been lurking by the concessions like a gargoyle, wasn't there. The counter, with its sunken acrylic case, stood unmanned. The lights in the corridor behind it were off, and the smell of scorched coffee lingered in a way that suggested recent abandonment. She gave it a polite interval, a full minute by the wall clock, and then stood, knees creaking, to do a reconnoitre. The teenager was nowhere, but the mop and bucket had been left in the middle of the sticky tile, and in the reflective surface of the glass doors she could see herself, a pale smudge, floating in the emptiness. "Hello?" she called, not loud. There was no echo. She hesitated. At the top, the booth door stood ajar. She pushed it gently. The projector was running, but wrong. One reel spun loose, the beam flickered, and in the corner sat the projectionist, slumped, eyes open and unseeing. Mrs. Larrabee didn't scream. She just nodded, as if something overdue had finally arrived. "Ah," she said, "so that's what it was." Behind her, the screen lit up again. No credits, no music, just the soft hiss of film starting over. Thank you for listening. I wish you a good night, and may you sleep blissfully, my friend.